back to Two Guys, One Ballot, where two ordinary guys cover one policy issue that's going to be on your ballot this November.
This is part of our series called
Ballot
to the Future, where we talk about something you're about to vote on, right?
Yeah. Today's episode is about the Gallagher Amendment. This is a complicated issue.
It's pronounced Galileo Amnesty.
Gallagher Amendment.
Gallagher Amendment.
Today's issue is probably the most complicated on the ballot. We don't really feel qualified to necessarily go into detail. We're going to try to make it simple and digestible, but we're going to include links below so that if you want to learn more about this topic, you can really dive in deep.
Sasha, what is the Gallagher Amendment anyway? Is that different from Gallagher the video game, or is that the same thing?
It's different from the video game.
Okay.
It might not be different from that show where they cuts the guy's head off. It comes from the 70s, where there was this movement where people were scared that property taxes would keep increasing. So this man in Colorado named Dennis Gallagher, he's still around, he's still politically active, proposed this amendment. And this amendment says that the amount of property taxes collected statewide is going to be at a fixed balance between commercial and residential properties. Commercial properties will always be 55% of all collected local property tax. And residential properties are going to be 45% of the total property taxes collected statewide.
So what's wrong with that?
Well, there's a couple issues with this. The first is that the amount of residences in Colorado has grown substantially more fast than the amount of commercial property space. So our tax base is really hampered by the fact that we've got lots and lots of people moving here, but industrial and office space hasn't really kept up.
So that means there's more and more residential real property to tax, right? And because that total tax amount can only ever be 45% of the total real property tax, it means that the tax rate on residential property has to go down and down.
That's right. So property taxes have actually been on a decrease in Denver and broader Colorado for some time.
And they've slid from, I think it was 21% tax assessment rate in the 80s when this was passed, to 7.15% now.
That's right. So the tax assessment rate is what portion of your property's value will actually be taxed. There's a second issue. Talk to us about that, Russell.
Well, the second issue is that different parts of Colorado haven't changed in the same way. So if you live in Denver, you look around and you see we have tons and tons of new housing inventory on the market. Well, that means that we are able to tax more and more money from residential real property. But in other counties, that hasn't really happened. So the result is that Denver's amount of residential real property tax collected goes up and up and up, and that fills the 45% bucket. That requires the residential real property tax rate to go down, right? Because we're still collecting revenue, but we can't ever go over 45% of the total real property tax collected. So the statewide assessment rate goes down. But in counties where they're not adding a bunch of new residential real property, they are losing tax money because they're still taxing the same amount of residential real property, but the tax rate's going down, so the actual amount that they can collect is less.
Yeah, so this is a complicated issue, and it's a little bit difficult to explain in a video, but there's one graphic that for us tells it all, and that is the proportion of K through 12 spending that used to come from county budgets that has now had to get pushed to the state budget. This actually is somewhat of a bipartisan issue. Both Republicans and Democrats don't like that, and they proposed that this go to get amended at the state constitution level. There is some controversy about this though, Russell. Tell us about that.
Controversy? Did Sean Connery tell you that? The controversy is the same controversy around taxes that we always face in Colorado, which is, it's true, the government's not very efficient. And so should we really be lifting the handcuffs on the state in order to allow them to tax more from different residential real property taxes or other taxes? Or should we be telling the state, you guys aren't managing the budget that well. If you need to find more money, why don't you figure out how to operate more efficiently?
There are other proposed fixes. Really, the fundamental problem isn't the 45-55 balance. It's that this is maintained at a statewide level when the state isn't growing proportionally in every local community.
Meaning, one statewide real property tax assessment rate doesn't fit all. When Denver residential real property shoots up in value in the aggregate, it means that tax revenue collectible on residential real property in the counties outside of Denver or in rural areas goes down and down, and that makes it harder and harder for them to fund their schools. That pulls money from the state budget to fund those schools, and so we sort of all lose.
Russell, how are we going to vote on this one?
I am a yes for this, and here's why. I say repeal this now, we'll figure out what the fix is later. A lot of people are worried, are my real property taxes gonna go up? But Colorado's legislature has already fixed for the foreseeable future the real property residential tax assessment rate, so your taxes won't go up directly as a result of this. Now, later, the legislature might decide it's time to raise taxes and they'll do that, but hopefully they'll do that as part of a more regional approach that fixes this problem overall.
I'm going to vote yes on this. This is a contributing factor in government just not being efficient. You kind of hear about these siloed buckets of money where money can be used for this, but it can't be used for that. And government can't really work when you don't allow policymakers to determine where money goes. With that said, I am worried that property taxes long term will just continue to rise and rise and rise. And we need to make sure that we put some limits on this in the future, but we need to fix this today.
Right. So don't take us to say that we think the Colorado government is really efficient and that we should just keep funding it in unlimited amounts. In fact, we think the opposite, I would say, which is that there are big inefficiencies in the way that the governments fund things, and even in the school system. And I think anyone who works in administration in the schools would probably tell you the same, which is that there is a lot of inefficiency and there are other issues besides just getting more funding into the system that hold our schools back.
So we're both a yes on this. Remember, we're two guys. We have no dog in the hunt here. We have no vested interest in how you vote on this. This is just our view of how policy should be made.